Now, it's too early to declare victory, but I think we can say with complete confidence that the enemies of Israel and the enemies of human rights have lost at Durban this time. Yes, Ahmadinejad's message of hate was applauded by other bigots who sat in that room. Some were just diplomats who don't like not to clap because they have to show their diplomacy. Others were villains, others who clapped because they supported this horrible message, this incitement to genocide. As my friend Irwin said, a man like Ahmadinejad shouldn't be speaking at the UN. He should be brought by the UN in front of a court, indicted for incitement to genocide, and sentenced to spend the rest of his life in a prison. In Iran, he wouldn't get that treatment. In Iran, if he were a 13-year-old Baha'i, he'd be executed. If he were a 14-year-old man who was homosexual or a child who was homosexual, he'd be executed. We don't want to execute him. We just want to put him in jail for the rest of his life. We just want the world to understand that when you come face to face with evil, you cannot do what the president of Switzerland did. How dare he extend a hand of warmth to this evil, terrible man? And he went too far this time because he has said that he did it in the name of the United States. You know, the Swiss government, they represent everybody. They represent the interests of the United States in dealing with Iran. Well, I hope no more. I have certainly put in the beginning a campaign to remove Switzerland as the country that deals with the interests of the United States. Switzerland has disqualified itself. It has shown it does not know how to confront evil. It treats Ahmadinejad the way it would treat a reasonable and legitimate head of state. They cannot represent the interests of real democracies and real believers in human rights if they take that kind of a conciliatory attitude. We all know that Switzerland's neutrality during the Second World War was anything but neutral. It was complicity. And I hope we will not see complicity with evil again in the name of support for and legitimation of Ahmadinejad. Because of you, ladies and gentlemen, because of you, Durban 2 has not been a repeat of Durban 1. Now, you can't cleanse Durban 1. It would be like having Nuremberg 2 after Nuremberg 1. We're not only interested in the words, the technical phraseology. That's bad enough because it repeats and adopts Durban 1. That's not the point. Durban 1 wasn't disgraceful only because of its lyrics, but also the music. The Nazi marching music, literally, that engulfed the streets of Durban and made it difficult for a young Jew to walk in peace. It reminded people of what it must have been like to live in Nuremberg in the 1930s. And the world can never accept that. The name Durban, unfortunately for the good people of Durban, has become a dirty word and has become a concept that cannot be cleansed by having a few words changed here and there and a few sentences changed here and there. The right approach was the approach taken by Canada. We have a representative of Canada here today, of the Harper government, and a representative of the opposition government, the former Attorney General and Minister of Justice, because in Canada, as in the United States, Israel is a bipartisan issue. It makes no difference whether you're a conservative or a liberal, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. If you're a person of decency, you support Israel. We are being heard at this conference. Our case is being made. We are having an impact. And the reason we have made a difference is you. You have made that difference. You have spoken up. You have chanted. You have shown what you think of evil when you confront it. You have confronted evil in every possible way, and it has made a difference. You know, we've always been right, but we've often not been listened to. This time we have not been silenced. We've refused to be silenced. From the moment that monster walked into the hotel, he was greeted with anything but silence. He was told by everybody he met with, every decent person, no, we will not accept your bigotry. The case for Israel is being made here today. The case for Israel is an easy case if people will only listen. The case for Israel can be made simply if people only accept the facts, if people engage in nuance. No, Israel's not a perfect country. The United States is not a perfect country. Canada is not a perfect country. There's no such thing as a perfect country. But Israel is a democracy struggling to do the right thing. In 60 years, Israel has accomplished more for the world than almost any nation of Europe. Compare Israel and Switzerland, comparable population. Switzerland has 7 million, Israel has 6 million. Consider the number of lives saved by Israel's medical technology. Consider the number of patents, the number of NASDAQ listings, the number of environmental innovations done by Israel in its 60 years, and compare it to what other European nations have done in 100 years. And imagine what the peace dividend would bring. Imagine if Israel could literally turn its spears into plowshares. Imagine what a dividend it would produce for world peace, for world health, for world environmental concerns. If only the entire world had Israel's human rights record, had Israel's records of dealing with women, of dealing with gays. Not perfect, but better than almost any other country. If every other country in the world had Israel's freedom of speech, Israel's freedom of dissent, Israel's Supreme Court, which is open to all without restrictions, without standing case and controversy, justiciability barriers. If only the Human Rights Council had countries like Israel sitting on it. Instead, Israel can't serve on that or other councils. If only nations of the world had representatives like Natan Sharansky representing it and being the face of goodness and freedom and liberty instead of the Ahmadinejads of the world. If only, if only. And when the best is called the worst, one has to turn one's eyes to the accuser. And one has to ask why. And the answer is very simple. Why is the world so obsessed with Israel? In order to change the subject. Shelby Steele, who's a great, great African-American commentator and speaker, made the point so eloquently yesterday and 2 days ago. Changing the subject. Changing the subject from the failures of third world countries. Changing the subject from the fact that Zimbabwe becomes free and then returns to tyranny. Changing the subject from the fact that Algeria wants to be a democracy, and yet it would vote in people who would cease allowing any freedom or democracy. Changing the subject about the failures all around the world. Changing the subject about how the Iranian Revolution has destroyed the lives of so many people in Iran. It's so easy to change the subject. All you have to do is talk about Jews. I'll never forget the story some years ago when Harvard imposed a quota system and wouldn't allow Jews to be admitted as students. And the president of Harvard, a racist named Lowell, said the reason for it is Jews cheat. And a learned hand, a great jurist, not Jewish, wrote to the president of Harvard and said, but Christians cheat too. And Lowell said, you're changing the subject now. We're talking about Jews. Well, you can't just do that. When you talk about human rights, you can't have special human rights for Jews. You know, they're conducting an investigation now of Israel's war crimes. Israel conducted itself better than any other nation in the world faced with comparable threats. Don't believe me. Listen to people like one of the leading experts on military law and military justice, Richard Kemp, a major colonel in the British Army. Israel, he said, had very little choice other than to carry on with its military operation until it reaches the conclusion it needs, which is to stop Hamas from firing rockets, etc. Then he says, from my knowledge of the IDF and the extent to which I've been following the operation, I don't think there has ever been a time in the history of warfare when any army has made more effort to reduce civilian casualties and deaths of innocent people than the IDF is doing today in Gaza. 100,000 phone calls, leaflets. Did it do a perfect job? No. Did every soldier behave perfectly? No. You don't judge a democracy by how an 18-year-old kid drafted in the army deals with crisis during the fog of war. You judge a democracy by the way the senior people deal with the soldier after reports have been made. And the Israeli government and the Israeli army is well known for looking hard at reasons for failure. Look at what happened after Shatila and Sabra. You didn't need an international court to look into that. The Israelis had their own investigative agency, and they came to some very, very harsh conclusions about the actions of soon-to-be Prime Minister of Israel. And that became a stain on his career.